Hello, everybody. Coming in for the third part of the little civil rights mini-series here that we've been having lately on the channel. This is going to be the third out of fourth part. I plan to finish the series up this week, so I will have the second and final video about the actual civil rights of the 1960s coming out on, I think, Friday, but it could be later this weekend, but I'm aiming for Friday. So we will discuss that again more at the end. So this is the third part of the series, and this will cover basically what we're going to cover today is Jim Crow laws slash segregation, since they go basically the Jim Crow laws allow for racial segregation, and I'm pretty sure I don't really need to do too much of an introduction to this topic because I think if you've gone to school any time since the 1960s, you've probably been taught about segregation. It's commonly taught about, especially when you talk about Martin Luther King Jr. It is very commonly talked about in history classes when you come to the 1960s, about the civil rights movement and everything else. And it isn't really given its own time period. It's more talked about as it's kind of mixed in with the civil rights of why they were protesting. Now, just a reminder here, Jim Crow laws started way before the 1960s. They were in place way before the civil rights movement came about. So that's what we're covering in this video. This will cover basically from the end of Reconstruction, from 1877, when Reconstruction was finally ended, when the federal government pulled the federal troops out of the South, to roughly the late 1940s is where I'm going to stop at, because that's when you start getting the civil rights, is during about the early 1950s when it starts with, of course, the starting gun, I suppose, would be such as the Brown versus Board of Education, which basically said that segregation in public schools was illegal and unconstitutional. And it's really started that process, but we'll talk about that more in the future fourth and final video. So, as I've stated, let's get right to the topic here. I do have some small images, and I do, of course, go off the notebook. So, let's start off here with the prelude to what brought about these laws. And this is more just a review from the previous video, so this will kind of be repeated facts. So, if you've seen the prior video, which I'll provide the thing for here at the end, in case you haven't, I will put that there. And this is basically just a little bit of a repeat of the events of what happened during Reconstruction. So Jim Crow laws have their roots in the Black Codes. As we mentioned in the previous video, during Reconstruction, the Black Codes were sets of laws passed by former Confederate states in 1865 and 1866 after the end of the Civil War. And these laws basically try to prohibit African Americans from really moving around. It tried to prohibit their freedoms. It tried to prohibit everything that they possibly do. Basically, it was slavery in everything but name and actual practice. What basically happened was the codes dictated where and how African Americans could work, where they could work, how they could work, and it also dictated how much compensation they would receive for that work. Which, in other terms, in case you don't know what that means how much are they going to get paid. And in most cases, may I remind you, African Americans, even in a normal-looking job, were paid far less than a white person was, because there was just that white supremacist idea going on then, as it is still going on somewhat now. Now, it seemed, as I mentioned, it seemed to be, to the southern states at least, it seemed to be a surefire way to try to keep the blacks in some form of servitude to the white population. They accepted that slavery was no longer allowed. It was illegal. With the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865, slavery was formally abolished in the country. The southern states, they conceded that. But they were not going to just willingly go ahead and give blacks every bit of the rights that they properly and should deserve. So they were going to do whatever they could to restrict those rights. That was legal by the system, or what it seemed. And to many of them, it seemed a good way to do so. And even when African Americans tried to protest and tried to get the laws and tried to fight against the laws, it really did no good in the South, where a lot of them still live, because that's where they have been slaves. But it really did no good because you had a lot of the state governments and state government positions were dominated by former Confederate generals or soldiers, and they were even some former Confederates who worked as police and judges. The South may have been lost the Civil War, but now these former Confederates are getting places of work, and there's to the Southern people, they're viewed as heroes. They're viewed as I quote here, as the martyrs of a lost cause. Yeah, that's a very touchy subject. I really don't want to get into right now, because I could go on and on about that one. Now, African Americans, they didn't receive any help from the legal system due to this. They weren't going to get help from the courts. They weren't going to get help from the police because they're dominated by former Confederates. The officials on the courts and on the law enforcement are already prejudiced against African Americans. You really think they're going to believe them when they say that crimes have been committed? No, they're not. And during Reconstruction, this is kind of a recap here, you had a lot of efforts from the Democratic Party. Yes, the Democratic Party, the one that, funny enough, I want to point this out. I just kind of find this curious. Today, and I'm not saying my own political beliefs here, I'm simply stating what I find odd. And today, from the political spectrum, it would seem that a lot of African Americans tend to lean with the Democrats, from what I've noticed. Well, I'm not saying that's wrong. But there's one question I have. Why exactly is that? Because it was the Democratic Party in the 1870s or late 1860s that was fomenting white supremacy in the South and wanting to end the Reconstruction and the repression of African American rights. But yet it was the Republicans who were trying to fight for them. But yet today, African Americans side with the Democrats, the very ones who tried to put them back in some form of slavery. I'm not saying it's wrong if you think you're a Democrat, but I just got a question here. Why would any African American deal with the Democratic Party given what they tried to do? Why? Anyway, as we had mentioned prior, it was the efforts of the Democratic Party, white supremacists in the South, and even President Andrew Johnson, who basically tried to cause a lot of conflict over trying to prevent African Americans from gaining their rights and freedoms after the Civil War. Eventually, Congress had to take over from Johnson, and even then, they still faced opposition in the South from white supremacists and Democratic leaders. Turn this. Now, and also kind of last review here is that violence rose with black schools and homes destroyed and everything. Violence was rising in the South during Reconstruction, as we said in the prior video. Black schools for African Americans were destroyed, their homes were destroyed, their property was destroyed, and there was even, of course, bands of white supremacist terrorist organizations that were going around terrifying African Americans, sometimes even lynching and killing them. And among the most famous of these was the KKK, who became the most prominent organization during the late 1860s and finally dissolved during the early 1870s due to the federal government measures. And it really was hampering African American citizens. Okay, so that was the prelude here. Now here is where we're going to get into some of the new stuff. After the end of Reconstruction in 1877, as we mentioned, when Rutherford B. Hayes was elected in 1876, a compromise was reached with the Democratic South that if he was elected and the Democrats acknowledged his election, that Hayes would pull out the remaining federal troops in the South when he became president. And he, of course, did this. So in 1877, the last federal troops are out of the South. There is no more federal occupation. There's no military occupation. All the Confederate states have been readmitted. It's basically, there's nothing in place to protect African American rights anymore because the federal government's not actually down there enforcing it any longer. And almost immediately after this happens, well, I'm pretty sure you can guess what happens. A lot of the southern states begin adopting new laws that start restricting the rights of African Americans in those states. Now, by the 1880s, so this ended in 1877, so now we're moving just a couple years ahead. By the 1880s, many African Americans are now moving into urban city areas from the country due to the fewer restrictions that are in place in the cities in the South, such as Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, Houston, Texas, I think, was growing at that time. New Orleans, Louisiana, however you want to say it. Little Rock, Arkansas. Charleston, South Carolina. A bunch of Memphis, Tennessee. Nashville. I'm trying to think of a bunch of big cities down here in the South. Tallahassee, Florida. Oh boy. Birmingham, Alabama. Montgomery, Alabama. It was just, you could go on forever. But anyway, a lot of them start moving into the city because prior to this, they had lived kind of on the countryside. Well, there's a lot more restriction. There's a lot less restrictions in the city because it's harder to enforce. So they start moving to the city, try to get a new life. And this happens during the 1880s. Well, by the 1890s, the population of African Americans has grown so large in most southern cities that many city-dwelling whites in the South start demanding that the state governments take further action to restrict African American rights. And the result of this becomes what we know as Jim Crow laws. Now, what are Jim Crow laws? Now, here's the very simple word to put it. Jim Crow laws are simply racial segregation laws, basically the separation of two races, basically keeping whites and blacks, or Caucasian and African Americans, separate. Now, it could mean other races, but in the South and in America, it tended to be white versus black. Now, this happens in the 1890s, so this is only maybe 30 years after the Civil War, 25 years. So, and this is only not even 20 years after the end of Reconstruction. This is like 15 years or so. Maybe even less than that. But what Jim Crow does is their name. First thing, where does the name come from? Well, Jim Crow is not exactly know where the name actually comes from, but our best guess falls to it's named after an old, pompous, goofy, theatrical African-American character that was in a lot of theatrical plays prior to the Civil War. It was a depiction of an African-American, and back at that time, of course, it was racist, so they depicted him as goofy, they depicted him as pompous, stupid. They were being a little bit prejudiced when they did this, and I actually have an image here of what this theatrical character looked like that they named the laws after, supposedly. This was the typical Jim Crow character in 19th century theatrical plays that the laws eventually became named after because, and of course in the South, there was that white supremacist thing that they all thought, oh, this is the black. No. 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 Even I have never seen a normal white person look like this, let alone another person of another race. Yeah. Yeah. Now, what the laws do, of course, as we mentioned, they keep the blacks apart from whites, especially in public areas in the city. And what this is going to impact is basically areas that they can go into. So here are what is going to start being restricted with these new Jim Crow slash segregation laws that are adopted in the 1890s and 1880s by most of the southern states. And keep in mind, some of them are actually adopted up north, but it's mostly the South, the former Confederacy. And what happens is, for instance, blacks are banned from public parks. No African American is allowed in a public park, only whites. How nice. And how stupid. Why would you ever do that? What's the problem? Segregation was also enforced almost everywhere else there could possibly be in a public space. For example, here's a list of them. You had segregation in theaters, restaurants, neighborhoods, pools, phone booths, hospitals, jails, asylums, and even residential homes. Basically, anywhere that you can possibly think of in public, there was segregation. There was a separation of races. Now, either this could be they were seated in different rooms. There was a room for like a waiting room. If there was a waiting room at a hospital, there would be one for whites and there'd be one for blacks. They were not allowed into the other's room. Neither race was allowed to go to the other room. Neither. For example, let me think here. Restaurants had black seating areas and white seating areas, or as I think what they termed them was colored. I think was what the sign said. They termed it as colored. Theaters would have, of course, not only just seating areas for whites and colored people, but they would even have different entrance doors. They'd have an entrance for whites and they have an entrance for blacks. And it goes on and on. Schools were the same way. Even drinking fountains at the park or something like that. Even restrooms. There was one for whites, one for blacks. One for whites, one for blacks. Constantly, 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 constantly. All throughout the South. And I mean all throughout it. And, oh my gosh. Now, some states even put specific ones in, such as for some states, in their schools at least, they require that whites are given separate textbooks from African Americans. Why? You think they got cooties? Well, they got a different skin color. That don't make them different. I want to stress that right now. Just because you have a different skin color makes you no different than the person that is next to you white as bleach. It makes you no different. None of it does. And it ain't just African Americans and whites either. It's Latinos. It's Asians. It don't matter. You're no different. So there should be no reason why, oh, we gotta separate from you. You're a different race. It ain't like they got something. Although right now, not by race, but by now, you probably don't want to go around nobody, no matter what race they are, because they might have a certain virus. So, yeah, right now, you probably don't want to go around nobody. But back then, really, you're going to separate on race? It's so stupid. So, basically, and there's other things here, too. As we mentioned, waiting rooms for buses and trains were required. Water fountains, building entrances, elevators. Oh, yes, they had separate elevators. Cemeteries. And even cashier windows. This is ridiculous. It's freaking ridiculous. I can tell you that right now. Now, what happens here is there's other specific ones that happen, such as in Atlanta, Georgia. And Georgia was really bad with segregation laws. And in Atlanta, Georgia, you actually have African Americans that would go to court. How in court you usually will swear upon a Bible before the trial or whatever, just to swear that you're telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. When Atlanta, Georgia, African Americans that were going to court would be given a separate Bible to swear upon. Oh yes, we get this stupid. We get this stupid over segregation that we have to hand them a separate Bible. What in the is wrong with the world? What would ever make you think that this is okay? What would ever make you think that this is necessary? Here's another one. In New Orleans, prostitutes were segregated. Now, I know that's probably a topic I don't want to talk about. But, yeah, it's that bad. We got to segregate the prostitutes. Yeah. I'm laughing here not because I find it good or nothing. I find this horrible. I'm laughing because I find it just how goofy that how people went to ensure that they were segregated. I find it goofy that people thought that this was necessary. Why? Why? Now, and here's another thing. In most southern states, even if a white and an African American, maybe they loved each other like they do now. Today, that's no problem. There's interracial marriages between all types of races today. Back then, that was a big no-no. If you loved an African American, a white was just as likely to be lynched and hung as he was, or he or she. Yeah, it was that bad. They prohibited marriage between whites and blacks in the South. There was to be no marriages. There was to be no cohabitation. You couldn't even live in the same room. You could not both rent an apartment and live together like some people do. You couldn't do that. Not if you were a different race. Now, many African Americans did protest these laws. Keep in mind, the civil rights didn't come until the 1950s and 1960s, but there were fighters all throughout the Jim Crow era. It wasn't until the 1950s and 1960s that it really gained a large momentum to the point that it came to finally constant national attention and it had to be addressed. Prior, there had been little screams and shouts in between, but nothing that was big enough to really get the government to move on its rear. And to make matters worse, may I add, that in 1915, the Ku Klux Klan, as we had mentioned in the last video, had gone extinct in 1871. Well, in 1915, a revival of the Klan happens in Georgia and the Klan is reformed. And may I add this was actually partly due to a movie that came out called The Birth of a Nation. This came out about, I think, 1915, I think by a man of D.W. Griffith. And it was a very controversial film. It was actually one of the very first big big motion picture films. It was very early. And there's actually copies of it, I think, in the congressional vaults or whatever they keep this stuff in. But it went up and covered basically up to the Civil War, the country's history, and a little bit in Reconstruction and that. But it had one big flaw. D.W. Griffith, who made the film, was a Southerner. And when he made this film, when he talked about when he brought to Reconstruction in this film, he portrayed the first Ku Klux Klan as like knights in shining armor, and they were saving the white people of the South, and he depicted African Americans as being these brutal, awful villains who were out for murder. The roles were true, but they were swapped. The murderous people were actually the Ku Klux, and the people that were not exactly knights in shining armor, but they were innocent and trying to help each other, were the African Americans. But D.W. Griffith, because he was part of the South, he swapped the roles to make it look good for his people. Yeah, not okay. Now, as we mentioned, many African Americans were protesting, and there were early leaders that tried to take individual stands. Among these were people such as Ida B. Wells, who wrote newspaper articles in the South, and she was from, I think, Tennessee, from around Memphis, and she would protest lynching, which was becoming increasingly common in the 20th century, early 20th century. Lynchings were becoming very common to African Americans, and she protested them. Well, she eventually got death threats in Memphis, and her newspaper printing area, I think, was demolished and attacked by a mob, but luckily she was not home at the time. And she actually fled north for the sake of her life and had to continue the rest of her protesting from the north. She got run out of the South because they were threatening to lynch her. You had other leaders such as Charlotte Hawkins Brown and Isaiah Montgomery. And Isaiah Montgomery, actually, he got the idea that whites and blacks could never cooperate. They could never live together. And so he got the idea, I'll form an African American community of just African Americans. And he did this in Mississippi. I forget the name of it, though. You can look it up. And this community actually still exists today, and even today, most of the population is African American. So he decided, well, if we can't get along, we'll just have our own separate communities where whites aren't allowed. That way there's no conflict. In 1896, of course, things get somewhat worse, and this was shortly after Jim Crow was starting to become commonplace. And that is the year that the Supreme Court has the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. The case of Homer Plessy, an African-American man, against the Ferguson Railroad Company, I believe it was, in, I think, Louisiana. And he had been, of course, Jim Crow laws were being passed. And even train cars were segregated. Blacks had certain areas they were allowed to sit in. Whites had certain areas they were allowed to sit in. There were certain areas they couldn't. Well, Plessy, Mr. Homer Plessy, he was sitting in the whites-only car, and he refused to move. This sounds similar to Rosa Parks years later, except that's on a bus. But this is him on a train. Well, because he wouldn't, they arrested him. And Plessy went to court to fight this. He fought that this was ridiculous, just like I do. And he went to the court, and eventually this case actually got to the Supreme Court. And this was going to basically determine, is segregation as a whole legal? And in one of the stupidest decisions the Supreme Court ever made, it ruled in the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case. The Supreme Court ruled that Plessy had been guilty of not cooperating with the law, and that basically segregation was legal. And they stated that segregation was legal as long as facilities for the two different races, for whites and blacks, as long as facilities for them were separate but equal. As long as they were separate but equal, as long as they were equal to each other, they could be separated all they wanted. The Supreme Court basically legalized segregation in 1896. Yeah. Nice going, Supreme Court. Things get no better. As we mentioned, the KKK does reform in the 1915, except this time they're not solely targeting African Americans, they also start targeting Roman Catholics. During the 1920s, many educated blacks start moving away from the South because they start realizing, I'm educated, but I'm never going to get a job down here because there's so much segregation. So a lot of the educated blacks start fleeing north to where they think they're going to have a better job opportunity. And this becomes known as the Great Migration during the 1920s. Then they're going north because they couldn't find any job opportunities south, and they're facing a lot of discrimination just due to their race. And before we go further, actually, no, I'll read this. Yeah, we're going to do this. We'll cover this little part. Now, I've covered that segregation existed in the South. Well, I hate to tell you this, it existed up north, too. Even though the North had not been a Confederate state, they had their own kind of bias toward African Americans, and they had segregation laws of their own. Even though northern states had never even had slavery, they did this. And some states even required blacks to own property prior to them being able to vote. And this is north. We're talking northern states now. Some northern states required them to own property before they could even vote. Others even had segregated schools and neighborhoods, just like those in the South. Now, the Great Depression in the 1930s did kind of deepen the divide between whites and blacks because they became envious of each other. They thought the other was going to do better, and they got jealous, fearing, and tried to attack each other. And it just decreased the attacks on African Americans across the nation because, especially in the South, many whites are angry about losing their savings. They're angry about the current situation of things. So where do you think they're going to take their anger out upon? The ones that they're going to try to blame for the problem. And when the U.S. enters World War II in 1941, blacks were allowed to join the military. They were allowed to join the military at earlier states. However, they serve in mostly segregated units. Blacks are kept in entirely separate units from whites. They're still segregated even in the military. And when the war ends in 1945, many African American veterans that come home from the war, even though they're heroes, they're still met with the discrimination and racism despite what they've done, despite their service to their country, despite fighting Hitler and the Nazis and Japan and all that, they're still met with discrimination. It's kind of ridiculous. And these Jim Crow laws go on until roughly the early 1950s, actually maybe the late 1940s, and I'll cover this one little part here into the era. And that's that we get in 1948, President Harry Truman officially, he signed an order that desegregated the American military. There was to be no more segregation in the U.S. Army. So this was really the first act of what's going to come to the civil rights. So I just want to stress this here. That's basically all there is on a separate account of the Jim Crow, is that the laws were passed. They were kind of based on the former black codes of the Reconstruction era, and they basically kept whites and blacks separate, and I mean separate. Any violation, they could serve jail time, they could do almost anything they wanted, and there was still violence against blacks. The Civil War is done, slavery is done, Reconstruction is done, but that white supremacy is still there in the South, and it remains there. And not only is it in the South, but it is also in the North. So, before we really end the video, of course, before we get to the full end here, we're going to show the photos. And I'll try to name you what states or locations this are. As I mentioned, theaters were segregated. This is the Rex Theater in Mississippi, And some theaters were segregated and had different entrances and that. Well, some theaters had an entirely different theater just for African Americans, as the Rex Theater in Mississippi did, for colored people. Yeah. May I keep you in mind, when the Supreme Court said that segregation was legal as long as the facilities were separate but equal, keep in mind, most facilities were not equal. Many cases, these facilities for African Americans and blacks were inferior to those for whites. They were not as well kept. They were dirty. They were filthy. And you go to a white's and it's perfectly clean. It's perfectly fine. Constantly broken or something like that. They were not equal. The Supreme Court said that, but no state really ever truly practiced that. Here's another one of, this is in a theater in Belzoni, Mississippi. We have a good image here of, I think this is in the 1930s, I believe. We have a black African American. He's going up to the colored admission entrance where they can go into the theater, and down here is the whites admission entrance. Yeah, ridiculous. You made them go through a separate door. Here, and this is an odd one, this is in Lancaster, Ohio. Oh yes, a northern state, and ironically my home state, so I'm kind of shocked. And this was at a restaurant in Lancaster, Ohio, and this was in the window of "We cater to white trade only." Basically saying African Americans, blacks will not be served here. Yeah, that's ridiculous. Here we have a colored waiting room sign at a Greyhound bus station in Georgia. I don't know what city in Georgia. And this was for indicating where the colored waiting room was. Here we have a man in Oklahoma City, in Oklahoma, during, I think, about 1938. And this, how I mentioned that even drinking fountains were colored. They had separate drinking fountains for white and blacks. And he is drinking at the colored drinking fountain. And over here you can kind of see the sign that the white one is probably this way. But yeah, that's ridiculous. Here, I don't know what state this is in. I don't know. I think it's either New York or it's Georgia. Even taxis had separate services or even indicated that they would not serve African Americans, such as these taxis, indicating we are whites only. We are only going to serve whites. How stupid. How stupid. What other ones do we have here? I think we just got two more. No, we don't. We have this one, though. As I mentioned, one of the three African American really big leaders, I mentioned Ida B. Wells. This is an image of her. She was run out of the South for her protesting against the Jim Crow laws and against the lynchings, and she continued it up north in where she moved. I think she fled to Illinois, if I'm not wrong, and continued the fight of protest up there. But unfortunately, she did not live to see the civil rights movement actually take place. So it's kind of sad. But she was one of the first early leaders trying to oppose this. And there were other leaders too, I suppose. The NAACP was also formed during that time era, during the early 19th century. You had other ones, such as Booker T. Washington was a big person that tried to fight against that. I'm trying to think if there's any. I know there's some other ones I'm not naming right off the top of my head, but I know there's some others. But there's a lot of them. There is a lot of early leaders, and they try to fight what they can. So segregation, it continued. It's now the problem. Slavery is not the problem. It's now segregation. And basically it proves that unless the federal government puts their foot down, the southern states are going to go back to this. We are going to have to step in once and for all and say, hey, we've given you long enough. Get your butt off the ground and start respecting what we've told you to do. Start integrating your population. Because this has gone on for almost 100 years. So, that ends it for this video. Now, the fourth and final part of the series will be on the civil rights movement, and that will cover the 1950s, 1960s, maybe a little into the 70s, and that's where, of course, a lot of us probably know about and that's where we'll cover how these laws really come to an end and African Americans are finally given their proper rights. So we will talk about that when that comes. Here on, I'm hoping for Friday to post that, but it could be on either Saturday or Sunday as well. But I'm hoping for Friday. So that covers that. Next week, I am hoping to start the series on the American Revolution. I may squeeze in the War of 1812 video then, but I'm looking to possibly just maybe delay that till July. I will do that this summer, but I'm looking at delaying that at this point. So I'm thinking of delaying that at the moment, and we'll just go ahead and start kicking off with the American Revolution series next week. But I do want to finish this one this week. So that is what's going to be going on so far. So if you like this video, if you liked any of the other previous videos, be sure to like them. Be sure to leave a comment in these comments below on them or on this very video. Let me know what you think, any facts that you may disagree with. I'm not going to judge you based on what you tell me. I will not. Let me see. Other than that, just the usual. Be sure to like, subscribe to the channel, see the other videos that we have on the channel here at all. And, of course, as always, if you have an idea, give it to me. I'll be more than happy to do a video on it. So that basically all wraps it up for this video. Hope everyone continues to have a wonderful little bit of their week. And we will see you back here, hopefully, for the final part of this civil rights series with the video on the civil rights movement of the 1960s, 1950s. So hopefully everyone stays safe and have a good day.